Assalamu alaikum and hello everyone. I'm your host, Hannah Zuberi, and welcome back to another episode of Justice for All Now. You're watching us on Muslim Network TV, where you can sure to find awesome Muslim focused TV shows, as well talk shows, as well as other things that interest the Muslim community. We're America's only Muslim focused network. You can always watch us 24/7 on Galaxy 19, Roku TV, Amazon Fire TV, and soon Apple TV. So today we wanted to discuss a really important topic, specifically when it comes to the American community in the United States and the Muslim community in the United States. With drastic increase in Islamophobia and hate crimes, both after 9/11 and after Trump's election to presidency, the Muslim community has gone through numerous obstacles to establish Islamic institutes in the United States. In this process, Muslims have experienced much discrimination from zoning officials, local zoning and planning boards, and governing bodies, which hinder the opportunities to purchase land or property to build mosques, schools, and community centers. We've experienced this locally here in the DMV. A very large Islamic school was moving into a beautiful rural area where another school used to exist, a Catholic school. Yet the reaction of the community and what was used, the laws that were used to keep the school until they fought the lawsuit for almost 2 years and they lost. And it was a big blow to the community because this was a beloved school that a lot of people wanted to grow. It had outgrown its building. So to discuss these sort of issues and much more, joining us today is Matthew Yusuf Sykes. Yusuf Sykes specializes in civil litigation under the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, known as RLUIPA, which involves local governments that infringe upon Islamic religious practices. Prior to establishing the law office of M. Yusuf Sykes, Mr. Sykes engaged in extensive studies of Arabic and Islamic law in Fez, Morocco, where he lived after working as a litigator for Covington, Burling in Washington, D.C., amongst other firms. We welcome Brother Sykes to the show, and we look forward to having a robust discussion with him. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. So I'm looking at this report that mentions 53 mosques that have experienced land use discriminations due to zoning laws. We're also, one of the other hats that I wear is I'm the editor-in-chief of Muslim Matters. So this issue crosses my desk a lot. We often get articles written by people who may have experienced it, or comments from people, or suggestions that people need to write more articles about this. So I wanted to, first, let's start with you. Tell us more about yourself, where your background. We heard a little bit about your studies in Morocco and your work in Washington, D.C. What made you finally decide to open an office specifically for religious land use cases?
So I've practiced law for about 7 years now. I should say 8. And during the time, I've really looked for an area of the law where there's an intersection between legal practice and serving Muslims, serving the deen, doing something that I see as pleasing to Allah, that I benefit from later on, a good work. And when I started out practicing law, I was with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, and I was doing justice-oriented type work. I was doing work for disabled students, educational advocacy. And then after that, my mindset changed a little bit, and I thought that, I should really study more about Islam itself, about the Islamic tradition. And that's what took me to the large firm, because I wanted to save up money so that I could go study. And that's what took me to Morocco. I was actually planning to study for much longer than I did. I wanted to do 10 years, but a combination of circumstances brought me back, COVID being one of them. And when I came back to the States, I thought, I should open up my own practice and really find an area of the law where I'll feel fulfilled, like I'm still doing something tied to the deen, tied to Islam, and that is benefiting the Muslims, and work that I think is needed. And I was practicing zoning law, land use. I was at a land use firm, and I got exposed to this area of the law. I reached out to CARE, and I just asked if they had any cases that they were unable to handle for whatever reason, or would need extra assistance on, that related to RLUIPA, which is the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. And I ended up handling a couple cases in the area, and I saw just how prevalent the issues were, and how in the Islamic community, there's very little knowledge about the laws and the rights that are provided under this federal statute. And so I thought it'd be a good area for me to specialize. And I thought it'd be something that's needed. So you mentioned 53 cases across the nation that have either been litigated in the past or are currently being litigated on behalf of Muslims and Islamic institutions that are facing discrimination. But I think that's really an underrepresentation of the number of masajid and institutions that experience this kind of discrimination, because I've seen in general, if, say, for example, you have a Muslim congregation that buys a plot of land and wants to make it a burial site, or buys a property that used to be a church and wants to make it a masjid, when they run into problems with the local zoning board or the planning board, I'd say 8 times out of 10 or 9 times out of 10, if they face a lot of opposition, they'll just pack up and find an area that is more welcoming, where they'll have an easier time. That a lot of times is easier from a cost perspective. For example, if a hearing is dragged out for months, it can be very hard on the congregation in terms of resources and presenting a case before the local board. And a lot of times they just pack up and leave, or they cede to a lot of the demands being placed on them by the board, or change their mission, change their approach, change their appearance to try to please the zoning board, and almost tone down how Islamic they are in hopes of getting their application approved. And that is something that's not necessarily right. Mm-hmm.
Could you please explain to us what exactly is the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act?
So technically speaking, it's a federal law that prohibits local governments from implementing zoning and other land use regulations that infringe on a person's or group's religious exercise. That's the technical definition. But it's basically a law that protects against religious discrimination in land use. So if a congregation or an individual, a group of individuals, or an institution, a nonprofit, buys a property or buys a plot of land and wants to use it for religious exercise, the law basically says that the township cannot substantially burden their religious exercise. The township cannot treat that religious exercise any different than a similar secular use. So, for example, a masjid in a lot of ways is similar in terms of it's a place where people congregate, come together. It's very similar to a community center, a secular community center, or a private club, or other secular uses that exist in many townships. And if it's found that the township has treated the house of worship any different than those secular uses, that is also prohibited under the statute. And you could bring a claim under RLUIPA to force the town, where the court will issue an injunction allowing you to use the property for religious exercise. It also provides, the statute provides that it's illegal to discriminate in terms of religion or religious denomination. So a township or a local municipality cannot treat, for example, masjid any different than it would treat a synagogue or a church. To give you an example, I had a case where the church was sold to a Muslim congregation wanted to turn it into a masjid. The church itself had not had off-street parking for over 100 years. But when the congregation bought it and wanted to turn it into a masjid, all of a sudden the township wanted to impose off-street parking requirements and require the masjid to buy property.
So that's an interesting way of, like, a lot of people don't even look at that as something of concern until their community has experienced that. So what are other ways that you've seen how these laws have been used to discriminate against Muslim communities?
There are a lot of technical requirements at the zoning board level. For example, if you're submitting an application for approval of a project, there's something required a lot of times if you're making, it's called a site plan, if you're making changes to the exterior of the building. It's usually not required if you're just changing things from the interior. I've seen cases where masjid will buy property and then the township will say, even though they're not changing anything on the outside of the building, that they need to submit a site plan, or they need to provide additional parking that wasn't there before, or they need to arrange to get a septic system installed that hadn't been there before. So imposing a lot of technical requirements, things that have to do with land use on a masjid that weren't otherwise imposed before the masjid was there at the property, or aren't being imposed to the same extent on churches, for example, or synagogues in the area, or on secular uses. So to give you another example, you may have a masjid that buys property in a strip mall and like a shopping center and wants to use it as a masjid, a suburb. And the township denies the use because they say there's not enough parking, and it requires them to do things like submit site plans and install other systems in the property that weren't there before. But then when a lawyer comes in and submits a request to the township to see how the township has treated other churches who have sought to do the same thing, they find that those requirements weren't imposed on the churches, or they weren't imposed on the synagogues. And that would not be the Muslim congregation at the time. So
does some of this surprise you?
Not at all. Not at all. It doesn't surprise me because Islam is something that is new somewhat in the U.S. I mean, it's been here, but in terms of Islamic institutions being widespread, I still struggle a lot of times to find a place to pray when I'm traveling or when I'm moving between areas, and people don't have a lot of personal connections and direct connections with Muslims. So I think that void is filled by what they hear in the media, what they see in the media, stereotypes about Islam. So when all of a sudden they get notice, before you go before the board for one of these hearings, they have to send out notice to the people in the neighborhood that live close by. When they receive notice that a masjid is going to be built in the neighborhood, their first reaction is a lot of people get scared, or they see it as a threat. They hear about stories of these places being hotbeds for terrorism, or for they have got all kinds of stories in their head. So even if, and you get hearings where the neighbors will turn out and say some of these things explicitly, where you see the kind of discrimination at play. But even when that doesn't happen, you can have a lot of these stereotypes that may not be said, but there are subtle things that a board can do to stop a masjid from coming into the community, like what we're talking about in terms of imposing certain requirements that weren't imposed before on different congregations of other faiths, as a way to discourage a masjid from being established, or for discourage an Islamic center from being established. So it doesn't surprise me at all.
When we look at these cases, especially, let's talk about like some of the more famous ones that we have witnessed is the Islamic Center of Murfreesboro in Tennessee. it faced much community opposition. In many other cases, the opposition is centered about neighborhood concerns about traffic, noise, parking, property values. That a lot of times, even churches, big churches, might get that. Maybe commercial construction project might get that. Um, but as you talked about, and we've seen, so those viral videos of opponents of mosques also cite fears about Islam, Sharia law, and terrorism. So to what extent can community resistance impact the implementation of these discriminatory land use and zoning laws?
I think it can influence uh, how the board treats an application, a land use application, because the board members a lot of times are elected officials,
Mm,
so they're answerable to the community.
mm,
So a lot of times, if they want to keep their job, they can't ruffle too many feathers. They can't make too many people upset. So it's directly connected, even if they don't acknowledge it, and they almost never will.
mm,
They won't acknowledge that they're being driven by any kind of discriminatory animus or ill feelings toward one religion or another. But I think it's a sort of unsaid reality, uh, and it's linked to money and jobs, of course.
mm. That
Yeah.
is so true. And because, and a lot of times the community itself might not be civically engaged.
Mhm.
People don't know who Muslims are. All they've seen is something on television about Muslims. So a lot of times, have you seen cases where people have sat down, the communities have sat down, talked about it, shared, broken bread together, and sort of like a case goes away? Or usually is that not the case? Pardon.
Do you mean people on the side of the township sitting down or the side of
Mhm.
the masjid?
Yeah, both masjid members of the mosque as well as the township sitting together and sort of talking it out.
Yes. So not all cases end badly.
Mhm.
There are a lot of cases where you may have a more tolerant board or a board in a township that has a larger number of Muslims, where Muslims are more established, and Muslims come in front of the board to say build any kind of institute or establish a burial site or anything, and the board has legitimate concerns about traffic, maybe because say this masjid or Islamic center is in a completely residential neighborhood and has a lot of congregants, they'll need a lot of parking, and they will discuss conditions that can be placed on the use so that the township doesn't run into issues in terms of
And
traffic,
the board has
safety, public welfare, that kind of thing. And at the end of the day, everyone's happy. Maybe the applicant, the congregation makes some exceptions, or they have to
can be
completely
placed.
on the use. But at the end of the day, they're small. Like they have to install some additional parking, but not a huge amount. They have to comply with other kind of requirements like lighting outside the masjid so that neighbors aren't disturbed, restricting lighting or restricting hours of use, that kind of thing. That happens a lot as well. Um, but it's interesting because
At the
I
end of the
think
day, it's small.
another thing that interested me in this area of the law is that there are a lot of issues that are untested, because there are not too many lawyers litigating in this area, not too many people focused specifically on it. So to give you an example, it's just something I've thought of. When you go to the Muslim world, you hear the adhan outside the masajid, um, and you can hear it if you're in the neighborhood, just like you can hear church bells in the U.S. But I haven't seen a masjid that places speakers outside the masjid to call the adhan. But there's an argument that it's essentially the same as church bells, um, and I think is a good argument. So that if the township tried to treat the adhan any differently, that you can make an argument that that's illegal and prohibited under RLUIPA. And I think it's an untested area. And I think there are a lot of examples of that. Uh, so it's another thing that interested me in this area of the law.
That's actually, yeah. I think Canada recently, after COVID, in several towns allowed the adhan to be transmitted, and it was a beautiful and very spiritual moment for those people from that town. But I haven't heard of anybody really doing that here in the United States, and I don't even know what the reaction would be like.
I've
You
seen a trend, at least in working on these kind of cases, where Muslim congregations will water down a lot of what they want to do before even coming to the board. They'll restrict themselves so as not to scare or upset anyone. They're so worried about scaring people that they'll come in front of the board and they've already made a lot of placed a lot of conditions on themselves that they don't need to place. They'll come and say, "Look,
So let's
we're
talk.
only."
I want to highlight that. Give
Yeah.
us like your top like tips to Muslim boards to get justice for them, to make, just going in. What should they be looking at? What type of people should be on the boards while you're going through building a masjid? Who should you
Yeah.
be electing onto your board, who or the committee? What sort of people are effective leaders? Like, should you have a whole committee of doctors trying to do this, or who do you recommend that should be on planning committees of mosques, and what should they be doing?
Um, so I think any board should be well-rounded. There
Mhm.
should be a variety of individuals on the board from a variety of backgrounds, both uh, converts as well as non-converts, immigrants as well as non-immigrants, educated people in all fields, people from the community, people who have moved to the community. There should just be a diversity on the board in terms of backgrounds, because with each person that has a different background, you get a different perspective, and maybe someone who knows a piece of information that others don't know. So that's helpful. And for example, if you just had one lawyer on the board who knows about RLUIPA, all it takes is one person to bring it up, and then the others can do the research. And maybe one person who deals with construction, or someone who has a background in that area who knows some information related to it, and can point the attention of others to certain issues. So that's key. Another piece of advice I would have is to not water down or restrict the Islamic nature of an Islamic institute. Don't, for example, think you need to make it interfaith, or you need to, instead of trying to get a use as a masjid, you need to go in and seek a use as a community center, because you think that might be more palatable to the board. Because when you do that, if you create a question as far as whether it's a religious organization or a secular organization, you could give up your rights under RLUIPA. RLUIPA only protects religious organizations, and you have to show that a religious exercise is affected. So don't restrict yourself to the point where it's questionable whether you're even a religious organization, or whether you're an Islamic organization. It's better to be completely upfront with all of those things, and that's a better way to protect your rights under the law. Because if it's questionable, then you give yourself gray areas, and it's harder to prove a case later on if you need to.
True.
Um,
Very true. See, that's really important to know, is not to water it down, and to make sure that you pass the litmus test of being a religious organization,
yeah.
even for yourself, before even going in to the board. What one of the things that I wanted to ask was, these have these discriminatory laws been challenged enough in order to allow for Islamic institutions to flourish? Has Have the zoning laws worsened, and like have they worsened in spite of the fact that there is a religious land use and institutionalized persons act? Or so yeah, I would love to get your comment on that.
In terms of just the trends,
Yeah.
I so the nature of zoning law is that it's unique to each specific municipality. Each municipality and each county will have their own zoning boards, and you get a lot of diversity in how the boards function from one town to another, depending on the population of the town, um, depending on a lot of factors, the income levels. So it's hard to paint with a broad brush in terms of how the whole country is doing in terms of this discrimination. But like I said earlier, I think that number that you mentioned in terms of the 53 cases that are litigated, I think that's a vast underrepresentation of the amount of discrimination that religious institutes face in trying to build Islamic schools or masajid or other Islamic institutes, because a lot of it's overlooked, a lot of it's swept under the rug. So you don't have very clear statistics or accurate statistics about how often this occurs. But we all have our anecdotes and personal experiences.
There have been cases filed and won too, right? CARE has won some cases.
Yeah.
Muslim Advocates has recently won a major case. Can you comment on some of those cases?
Yeah, so to give an example of a well-known successful case in New Jersey, the Baskin Ridge case, where you had the township placing different parking requirements on the masjid because they were saying that the nature of Islamic worship is that it generates more traffic. And the court said that that is illegal under RLUIPA, that you cannot say that, this one religious denomination, their practices are different, so they need to be treated differently under our zoning code. No, if there's a parking requirement, it has to be applied uniformly, regardless of the denomination or the specific religion at issue. And there was a large settlement in that case, and there was also a lot of examples of just outright and explicit discrimination. You had ISIS written on the mailbox of the masjid, and neighbors were coming out to the boards.
That happened. Did that happen in Virginia?
That happened in New Jersey too. It's probably happened in more than one place. Yeah.
Yeah, we had a case in Virginia, I believe, that one of the imam's mailboxes was shot up. So while they were going through their expansion project. So yes, it is. This is a manner that it places across, and you would think that it would just happen in rural areas, but even in places where there are large amount of Muslims and people are used to Muslims and their practices, a lot of these cases still occur. One in 2010, like right in New York City, was the proposed Islamic Cultural Center near Ground Zero. So, at that time, I believe, so before then, I think the record says that there were only 2 cases that were brought to CARE's attention, but then in 2016, they recorded 14 cases and a 50% increase in reports of anti-Muslim incidents, including vandalism, employment discrimination, and denial of services. Have you seen similar occurrences in New Jersey?
So
in that time?
It goes beyond my experience in this area of the law in terms of time frame. I've been practicing since 2011, but in terms of focusing on this area of the law, specific area, is more recent. So, like for example, I heard of the case in 2010 in New York, but at the time it wasn't on my radar as much. So I couldn't really give you an impression in terms of, other than just my general impression based on just my experiences here in America and being a Muslim and also being a convert. My general experience is that animus and discrimination that Muslims face has increased. And like I said earlier, I think it's just a product of public perception, both a spotlight being placed on Islam, and that affecting public perception when a lot of the media is negative. To give just an example, I've never seen, for example, a primetime media story. Maybe they're out there like on BBC, but at least in terms of the American networks, primetime media coverage of the number of pilgrims during Hajj. It's just like a large gathering of people anywhere in the world, all with a common purpose. And it's just amazing when you think about it. It doesn't happen in general anywhere else in the world, but it's rarely even, I never even knew it occurred before I became Muslim. I didn't know it was happening. So you don't see any spotlight brought on the religion unless it's something negative in general, not in all cases, but by and large. So I think that has an effect on people's perception, and they tend to operate based on it. And then you see this kind of discrimination.
So, based on your professional expertise, what can Muslim communities do in order to further combat these land use discrimination?
I think Muslim communities can better educate themselves about their legal rights. If they're preparing a land use application or purchasing a new property, number one, they should research the particular zoning district that they're planning to buy in or develop in, see whether houses of worship are permitted use. Sometimes, if a house of worship isn't a permitted use at all, but other institutional uses are permitted, like community centers, this can be a claim in itself. Um, but it should do its homework as far as the law is concerned. Also, do a Google search, do or look at the DOJ's website, look at other resources out there in terms of what are the protections for religious exercise, so that they know what their rights are, and can be fully prepared. And also, don't be hesitant if they feel like there's discrimination going on to consult with counsel, to call CARE. To call other attorneys specializing in this area of the law just to get an opinion about what's going on and whether there's actually something illegal going on.
How would we find you? Like, if I was on the board, is there like a resources page, a website somewhere that,
Mhm.
and I'm just thinking, why hasn't something like that been developed by the Muslim community if so many mosques go through it? Is it because the zoning laws are so different from place to place?
I'm not sure the reason. I think it's uh, number one, it's a little known area of the law. I practiced for almost 10 years and didn't know about it.
Hmm.
And I think there's just a small number of Muslim attorneys that are really focused on this area. I don't know. I mean, that's what encouraged me or inspired me to start my practice. In terms of how they would reach out to me, I don't know if you provided my contact information, but I'm open.
Love to. We'd love to put that up, and for legal assistance, call Yusuf Sykes' office. This is going out to any community who's, and so you were able to practice throughout the country.
So I'm licensed in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and DC. But if filing RLUIPA is a federal law, so if I was to file a lawsuit under RLUIPA, I can seek to be admitted, they call it pro hac vice, in the jurisdiction of the cases. So I can practice in any state. I would just need to be admitted pro hac vice. It's an application I would do with court. So I'm open to considering cases from across the country.
Okay. That's excellent to know, because this is really important, because just in just past 10 years of covering and covering the Muslim community, writing about it, this has come up so many times. And just to have now the next stage of development where we are having lawyers from within the community tackle this issue because it's so prevalent is really exciting. And it's we need to share this with as many people as possible. But I'd really urge development of resources as well, because a lot of times when communities are going out to make mosques, they don't know. So maybe like, even a just short articles or something of that sort, that if someone was Googling it, it would come up. And they,
Yeah.
before you plan a masjid, look at, this stuff, or these are resources. So that would be really, I think, a powerful resource for
So
community.
I'm also currently working on trainings for RLUIPA, religious rights, which I'm hoping to present through organizations like ICMA and ISNA. So I think training is another essential thing, because even if the congregation doesn't retain counsel, it'd be helpful for them to go through a training where they know their legal rights. Because a lot of times boards aren't knowledgeable about RLUIPA either. So even just bringing it to their attention, it doesn't have to be done by a lawyer. It can be done by a member of the congregation. That can go a long way in terms of helping.
Put that definitely training. I think it should be mandatory training for masjid boards.
Yeah, I
Things like
agree.
that, civil rights, along with civil rights training, trainings like this, when you sign up and get elected to be on a masjid board, you go in with nothing. Like it's just you put your name on the ballot and then you're thrown in, and now you're running these sometimes mega, projects, millions of dollars without any expertise. And I mean, I kudos to our elders who have fought it out without, knowing a lot of times they were immigrants and they didn't know the law, or the indigenous ones, they were so crushed by the amount of money needed to fight these cases that the communities couldn't afford it. So
Yeah.
it's really like, and this is exactly how Islamophobia is institutionalized. And this is when people don't, when you talk about institutionalized Islamophobia, this is exactly what we mean, is
Yeah.
things like this occur. And what have
Yeah.
you seen, like when you were actually fighting those cases? I'd love to, hear some of those stories from the courthouse, or from like where you've, like, what was your toughest case yet?
Uh, because my cases are still ongoing. I have a feeling in terms of what will be my toughest case. It's a case. So, and because it's ongoing, there's only so much I can say because of confidentiality issues. But just in general, what makes for a tough case is when you have mixed uses. For example, if you have an Islamic institution that rents part of its space to a secular school, or uses part of it for secular use, that has other uses within the masjid, or accessory uses that go with the masjid, like exercise areas, or basketball courts, or other things that are also used by non-members of the congregation, say by other groups within the township. Then it becomes a question of whether those particular parts of the building are being used for religious purposes, for religious exercise. So those make for tougher cases, and it's an area of the law that is unsettled across the country in a lot of areas. So the law varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and new laws always being created under RLUIPA. So in general, when you get a big case, say involving a big community center or Islamic institution like that, that's large, that has a lot of different mixed uses, it can make for a harder case than just your general masjid, for example, like your traditional masjid. That's very clear that it's just a purely religious use.
Mm.
Yeah.
So when we look at cases like, for example, what happened in, and I hope I'm pronouncing this right,
Mhm.
Bayonne, New Jersey. Um,
Bayonne?
but yeah, so this was in 2017,
Mhm.
where the chairman of the zoning board literally had to reprimand the group of people who had come in, because said that they were. It's not a religious issue; it's a zoning issue, and don't make it. So when are those things conflated? Like, when is it really a zoning issue, and what should Muslim communities look out for? Like, so we're not really breaking the law. And a follow up to that is, can zoning laws be changed?
Um, so I think my number one point in response to that would be that just because it's a purely zoning issue doesn't mean that you don't have a case, because you can have a purely zoning issue that creates an undue burden on religious exercise.
Mm-hmm.
For example, if you have a zoning district that just does not allow for houses of worship, and that's not just for masajid, that's for any house of worship, but it places a burden on the masjid because other areas within the township are unavailable for development, and it's really the only area that's feasible for them to build. This area that does not allow houses of worship, that's a purely zoning issue, and you could say it's not based on Islam or any one denomination, but it's still, you can still have a challenge or a case under RLUIPA. And so, and your question, I think, had two parts. I mean, in terms of, could you repeat it for me?
Yeah, the second part of my question
Oh,
are, can zoning laws be changed? So
uh,
if is it a hard and fast rule that can never be changed? Is there a methodology for that change? Because there are
zoning law.
places that used to be residential, and now you see commercial. They become commercial. So yeah, if you could talk a little bit
Yeah,
about.
yeah, yeah. So zoning laws can be changed. The zoning code, each township will have its zoning ordinance that sets forth its zoning requirements, and it can change. It can go through the proper procedure within the township to change those zoning laws. Sometimes you have townships that will change a zoning law in the middle of a land use application
Mm.
to make it harder for an application to go through.
Oh
Uh,
wow.
for example, you may have, there was a case that I read about recently um, where it actually involved a church that bought a property in a rural area that did not prohibit private institutions, but it prohibited residential uses. So in this rural area, you cannot build a house, but you could build a private institution. But after the church went to develop the property, the township passed an ordinance saying that you could not have a private institution in the area. And that was a successful case because they were successful in showing that it burdened religious exercise.
Mm-hmm.
You can have zoning boards that change the zoning laws in the middle of an application. It happens as well.
That's fascinating to hear. I mean, and it does get and sometimes, like when I look back at the case over here locally of the Islamic school, sometimes it is valid that there will be much more traffic coming into the school in the morning, in the evening, and or some. But then it was a school beforehand too, so there must have been traffic in the morning and evening as well. But
Yeah,
one of the things, that mistakes that I think some of the community members did, is they released, and I don't know, maybe it wasn't a mistake. I would love to get your opinion on this. They released a model of what they proposed would look like, because that helps with fundraising, right? Like if
yeah,
it was a beautiful architectural rendering of a beautiful mosque, and then the school, and then a hostel, perhaps a university campus, because it was 62 or 62 acres of land or something, 100 acres of land, so a lot of land. So they did have that capacity to build.
yeah,
But when people saw that, and they're like, hey, we live out in the rural area, we want horses, we want peace and quiet, we don't want this in the middle of our so that's something, seeing something like that, what is your
yeah.
reaction?
So even if they released plans showing that they were planning a huge project, um, it shouldn't be the final determining factor in terms of their land use application,
Mm,
because when you look at these cases, the courts always they look to see whether there were conditions that could have been imposed by the board where they still allowed the use, but just with conditions. So
mm,
instead of denying the use outright, the board could have said, "Look, you're going to have to downsize.
mm,
You can't." Uh, have this specific use or that specific use, or your number of congregants has to be limited, versus just outright denying the use.
yes.
Um, so I don't think, even if they released huge plans, those plans can be changed, and that's something that needs to be mentioned to the board. If the board seems inclined to deny an application outright, they need to be reminded that no, you can impose conditions. You can limit the use somewhat so that your concerns are addressed, but you don't just outright deny the use so that the congregation can't even use the property,
Property. Mm.
which happens a lot of times. And there's a huge loss in donations, money is lost, time, a lot of time's wasted. It causes a lot of damage for the congregation. Uh, yeah.
Uh, do churches face similar discrimination ever?
Uh, yes and no. So there are cases out there, a lot of cases where there are undue burdens placed on churches. So they argue that this, because of the way the zoning is set out, they're unable to build the church that they wanted to build or exercise their religion the way they see fit. They give an example. There's a case where a church had an area outside for homeless to sleep and to basically have a place to come. And the police started coming in and removing people, arresting people. And the church went before the court and said, no, this is part of our religious exercise, caring for the homeless. And they won.
So they won.
They won in proving that the township's actions were interfering with their religious exercise.
Wow.
That's one example. But there are a lot of cases out there with churches. I think in terms of just the RLUIPA precedent and law in general, that you have more cases involving churches because Christianity has been here longer and it's more widespread, and there are more opportunity for people to bring cases, even if they're not valid cases. There are a lot more cases that are brought versus a relatively small number of cases I think that have been brought on behalf of Masajid, because as a community, I don't think we're as enfranchised, and even though we're getting there, but it's a matter of income level, how enfranchised, how the roots in the community. It gives you access to things like legal services and wealth that's necessary to bring these kind of cases. So I think it's an area where we still need work and more representation.
So as we're wrapping up the hour, we talk about this case where the New Jersey Township had to pay the masjid $3.25 million to settle a discrimination lawsuit. So do you recommend mosques who perhaps have been through this to contact you as well? Would this be a case that perhaps, even if they don't go ahead and build the mosque there anymore,
Mm-hmm.
this be a route to take to sue? So some of those costs could be that were reincurred could be won back. We see right here that this New Jersey mosque won $3.25 million. That could be another
Yeah.
money.
Yeah, definitely. If there's a case there, if the law has been violated, then I don't think a mosque should hesitate to resort to the courts in terms of getting the use they want, the religious use. Now, we didn't mention this, and I think it's something that should be mentioned. What can you get under RLUIPA? You can get an injunction where your use is granted. You're allowed to build and develop as you want, or the board has to go through and issue the proper permits according to law. And if there was any damage that was done by the board's actions or by the township's actions, by the local government's actions, where you can show that, look, we lost X amount of donations because we had to be closed during Ramadan, for example. We lost contracts with our developers because of the delays. We lost other funds because of what happened. Then you can recover those damages in some instances. And there's also attorney's fees. So if you have an attorney willing to cover the case on a contingency fee basis, and what that is he'll seek to recover his fees at the end of the case versus at the beginning where they would be out of pocket. So we're looking at a fee shifting provision where if the plaintiffs are successful, then they can get their attorney's fees covered as well. And I think that's part of how big that number is in the New Jersey case. I think attorney's fees were included as well.
That's really great. That's a positive note to end on. Well, thank you so much for being here today, and this is absolutely a justice issue. Our show usually deals with larger, broader issues, but this is something institutionalized. When things like these are institutionalized, that's when you know that your country itself is headed towards fascism, especially under a administration that is not friendly to Muslims in many, many, many ways. So this is something to just keep us to keep an eye on. Please do use the legal assistance. Contact Yusuf Sykes at 609-470-8219. And we're grateful for him to be on the show, and we're grateful for your audience. Thank you for joining us and being with us. Assalamu alaikum.